I've spent years convincing myself that what I saw wasn't real, that my memory warped it somehow, or that I imagined parts of it. But when I close my eyes, it's all still there. Every detail, burned into my mind like a scar I'll carry for the rest of my life. People like to think places are just places, that an abandoned warehouse is just some crumbling ruin filled with old junk and shadows. But they're wrong. Some places hold on to things. Some places see too much, soak in too much. The warehouse is gone now, bulldozed, replaced by a featureless parking lot that nobody uses. They didn't find anything when they leveled it, at least not anything they told the public about. But it doesn't matter. The truth is, I didn't need anyone to tell me what that place was. I saw it for myself, and no amount of forgetting will ever erase what happened when I went inside. It started with a drive. I was in one of those moods where I didn't want to go home, but I couldn't stand to be around people either. My life had been crumbling for months by then. First, I lost my job. Then I lost my apartment and had to move into a cramped little place that smelled like mildew no matter how much I cleaned it. My friends tried to stay supportive, but I could tell they were tired of me. "You're gonna get through this," they'd say, like it was that easy. So I drove. Hours of winding through empty streets, letting the quiet hum of the engine drown out the noise in my head. I didn't care where I was going. I just wanted to feel like I was moving forward, even if it was only for a little while. It was late when I saw the warehouse. The streetlights in that part of town were dead, but my headlights caught it, a massive looming structure at the edge of a cracked asphalt lot. The building looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Its walls were streaked with rust, its windows shattered and black. A chain-link fence surrounded it, but parts of the fence had collapsed, the metal twisted and mangled. Weeds grew thick and wild along its base, almost hiding the broken gaps. I didn't plan to stop. I didn't even plan to slow down. But something about the way it sat there, so still and quiet, made me pull over. The air was damp and cold when I stepped out of the car, carrying that smell you get in industrial lots, wet concrete and old metal. The warehouse loomed in front of me, a dark shape against the starless sky. The longer I stared at it, the more it seemed to swallow up the world around it. I told myself I wouldn't stay long. Just a quick look, enough to satisfy whatever curiosity had brought me there. The side door hung crooked on its hinges, the rusted metal frame warped and jagged. It groaned loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing into the vast darkness beyond. Inside, the air was colder, heavier, and the smell was worse. Mildew and rot, mixed with something sharper, sour. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, casting jittery beams across the floor. It was a mess of debris, splintered wood, broken glass, crumpled papers. Whatever the warehouse had once been used for, it was long past its prime. I could feel the silence pressing against my ears, thick and oppressive. Every step I took seemed too loud, the crunch of debris under my boots echoing through the cavernous space. As I moved deeper into the warehouse, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. The floor was covered in dust, but there were places where the dust had been disturbed. Clear trails cut through the grime, like something had been dragged across it. My flashlight caught a dark shape lying near one of the support beams, a crumpled jacket. I crouched down, the beam steady on the fabric. It was torn, the seams frayed and dirty, and there were stains across the front. Dark stains, old stains. Nearby, I saw a single shoe, its laces tangled and caked with grime. The knot in my stomach tightened, but I told myself it was nothing. Just garbage, left behind by whoever had squatted here last. But then I looked closer. The drag marks in the dust. They led away from the jacket, away from the shoe, deeper into the warehouse. The drag marks led me to a set of stairs near the center of the warehouse. They climbed to a small office that overlooked the main floor, its glass window cracked and filthy. The smell was worse here, sharp and sour, making my throat burn. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, my flashlight aimed at the door. Part of me wanted to turn back, but my legs carried me forward. The stairs creaked loudly under my weight, each step sending a cold sweat down my neck. When I reached the top, I saw that the office door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges squealing. The office was a mess. Papers were scattered across the desk, curling at the edges. A chair lay on its side near the corner, one of its wheels missing. And there, in the middle of the room, was the camera. It was an old camcorder mounted on a tripod and pointed directly at the desk. The red recording light blinked faintly, casting a faint glow in the darkness. I stared at it for what felt like forever. Who had left it here? And why was it still running? My hand trembled as I reached out and pressed stop. The light went out, leaving the room in darkness except for the weak beam of my flashlight. On the desk, I noticed a stack of tapes, their labels smudged and faded. I picked up the one closest to me, turning it over in my hands. I don't know why I took it. Maybe I thought it would explain what I'd seen so far. Maybe I just needed to know. When I got home, I sat in my living room, the tape clutched in my hands. My camcorder was ancient, covered in dust, but it still worked. I slid the tape in, my fingers trembling. The screen flickered, the image distorted with static. At first, there was nothing but a shaky view of the desk. Then, a man stepped into frame. The man was tall and lean, dressed in dark clothes that blurred into the grainy footage. His face was partially obscured, the shadows cast by a single light bulb making it impossible to see his features. He moved deliberately, his hands clasped behind his back as he paced behind the desk. Another figure entered the frame, smaller and hesitant. They looked young, teenage, maybe younger, but their features were blurred, the quality of the recording too poor to make them out clearly. The man gestured toward the chair in front of the desk. The smaller figure hesitated, then sat, their shoulders hunched and trembling. There was no sound, but the man's body language was unmistakable. He was calm, methodical, leaning forward as he spoke. The smaller figure shook their head, shrinking back in the chair. My stomach churned as I watched the man walk around the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. The smaller figure flinched, pulling at something around their wrists. The tape cut to static. I rewound it, watching again and again. The third time through, I noticed the stains on the floor around the chair. The fourth time, I saw the glint of something metallic in the man's hand as he moved around the desk. By the fifth time, I was shaking so hard I had to stop the tape and walk away. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the images from the tape looping endlessly in my mind. The desk, the man, the trembling figure in the chair. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the drag marks on the warehouse floor, about the jacket and the shoe. By morning, I knew I couldn't leave it alone. I had to go back. The drive to the warehouse felt longer this time, the silence in the car heavier. When I pulled into the lot, the sight of the building made my stomach twist. The air felt colder as I stepped out of the car, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I made my way inside, following the same path I'd taken before. But when I reached the office, the room was empty. The desk and chair were gone. The tripod stood in the corner, its legs bent and rusting, but everything else had been stripped away. The trails in the dust, however, were still there, and this time, they were clearer. They led away from the office, deeper into the warehouse. The trails ended at a small rusted hatch near the back wall of the warehouse. It was partially hidden beneath a pile of debris, but the marks in the dust were unmistakable. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. My flashlight beam wavered as I leaned closer, the sour smell growing stronger. When I pulled the hatch open, the hinges shrieked, the sound cutting through the silence like a scream. Below was a ladder descending into darkness. I didn't want to go down. Every part of me screamed to leave, to run. But something stronger, curiosity, desperation, or maybe just stupidity, kept me rooted in place. I climbed down, the rungs cold and slick beneath my hands. The air below was damp and suffocating, the smell of rot almost unbearable. I found myself in a narrow corridor, its walls streaked with mold and grime. The floor was uneven, puddles of stagnant water reflecting my flashlight's weak beam. The corridor was lined with doors, each one made of rusting metal. Most were closed, but a few were slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of what lay beyond. The first room was empty, its floor littered with broken chains. The second held shelves stacked with objects I couldn't bring myself to examine too closely. Ropes, tools, scraps of stained fabric. The third door was locked, its handle coated in rust. I didn't try to open it. I moved deeper into the corridor, my steps slow and deliberate. My flashlight flickered, the beam casting jittery shadows that danced across the walls. At the end of the corridor was a larger room, its door hanging wide open. The walls were lined with more shelves, each one holding items that made my stomach turn. Jars filled with murky liquid, piles of clothing that looked far too recent, and tools that were sharp and rusted. In the center of the room was a metal table, its surface scarred and stained. Chains hung from its edges, the metal glinting faintly in the dim light. Above the table, mounted on the ceiling, was another camera. Its red light was blinking. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The camera was live. I turned slowly, my flashlight sweeping the room, half expecting someone to step out of the shadows. But I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the table and the blinking red light. Time felt frozen, the air too thick to breathe. When I finally moved, it was like my body was acting on its own. I turned and ran, my footsteps splashing through the puddles as I made my way back down the corridor. The ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed, my hands slick with sweat and grime. When I reached the main floor of the warehouse, I didn't stop. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as my heart hammered in my chest. The engine roared to life and I sped out of the lot. The image of that room burned into my mind. After I escaped the warehouse, I told myself I wouldn't think about it anymore. I wouldn't talk about it, wouldn't tell anyone. And for a while, I managed. I threw the tape in the trash, locked the memory away in a part of my mind I didn't want to visit, and tried to move on. But something about it lingered. I'd drive past the old industrial district on my way to work, and my eyes would drift toward the empty lot where the warehouse had been. Even though I hadn't been back, the images would flicker in my head. The dragging marks on the floor, the blinking red light, the table. I started having nightmares. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, hearing the faint creak of the ladder or the heavy scrape of metal against concrete. So a few weeks after they tore it down, I broke my promise to myself. I started looking for answers. It wasn't easy. The warehouse wasn't listed on any public records. The lot itself was registered under a company name, something generic like Northside Holdings LLC. I dug through old city plans, zoning records, anything that could give me a lead. The building had been part of an industrial expansion back in the 1950s, originally used by a steel company that went under in the 1980s. After that, the property changed hands half a dozen times before disappearing from public records entirely. The only concrete lead I found was a lawsuit filed in the late 1990s. It was buried in a stack of scanned court records, a wrongful termination case brought by a man who'd worked security at the warehouse. I wouldn't have thought twice about it if it weren't for the details. The man, a night guard, had claimed he'd been fired after reporting inappropriate activity to his supervisor. The lawsuit was dismissed, but one phrase stuck with me. Certain rooms should not be entered. It took weeks to track him down. I found him in a small house on the outskirts of town, a recluse who answered the door only after I told him I wasn't selling anything. His name was Harold, and he looked older than his years. His face lined, his hands trembling. At first, he didn't want to talk. He tried to brush me off, muttering something about how the past didn't matter. But when I mentioned the lawsuit, his expression changed. "You've been to that place, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low and trembling. I nodded. He let me inside, shutting the door quickly behind me. Harold had worked security at the warehouse for 6 years, starting in the late 90s. By then, the building was being used as a storage facility for an unnamed client. He described it as quiet, boring work at first, just walking the floor, keeping an eye on the occasional delivery. But then things started to change. It was subtle at first, he said. A new manager came in, started making changes. locked certain rooms, added more cameras, told us to stick to the main floor and leave everything else alone. He paused, his hands twisting in his lap. But it wasn't just the rooms. It was the deliveries. They started coming late at night, always unmarked vans. I wasn't supposed to ask questions, just sign the paperwork and let them unload. But the things they brought in... What things? I asked. Harold shook his head. I didn't open the crates. I didn't want to know. But the smell, it stayed with me. Like something rotten. Something dead. The breaking point came one night in the winter of 1998. Harold had been working the graveyard shift, his breath fogging in the freezing air. He was making his rounds when he heard something. A faint, muffled sound coming from one of the locked rooms. It sounded like crying, he said. A kid, maybe. I couldn't just ignore it. Against his better judgment, Harold used his keys to unlock the door. The room was small, its walls lined with shelves and strange equipment he couldn't identify. In the center was a chair, bolted to the floor, with straps hanging from its arms and legs. There was no one in the room, but the crying continued, coming from somewhere beneath the floor. That's when I saw it, he said. The hatch. The hatch was partially hidden beneath a stack of crates, its edges rusted and stained. Harold lifted it and peered inside, his flashlight beam cutting into the darkness. There was a ladder, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And when I shined my light down, I saw someone sitting there, looking up at me. Harold didn't describe what he saw. He just shook his head, his hands trembling so badly he spilled the tea he'd been holding. I shut the hatch and walked out, he said. Didn't tell anyone, didn't go back. But that was the night I got fired. They must have known I'd opened it. I don't know how, but they knew. After meeting Harold, I started digging deeper into the warehouse's history. I spent hours in the library, combing through old newspapers and archives. Most of what I found was mundane, corporate disputes, zoning complaints. But buried among the articles were stories of disappearances. The first was in 1974, a steelworker named Daniel Carter, who vanished after his shift. His co-workers claimed he'd left the warehouse late at night but never made it home. His car was found abandoned in the lot the next morning. Over the next 3 decades, there were more. A delivery driver in 1983, a cleaning crew supervisor in 1991, 2 teenagers who'd been exploring the area in 1995. All of them were last seen at the warehouse. The police reports were sparse, filled with phrases like, no evidence of foul play and insufficient leads. But the pattern was clear. I shouldn't have gone back for the tape. It had been sitting in the trash since the night I'd first watched it, buried under coffee grounds and crumpled paper. But now, with everything I'd learned, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I retrieved it, brushing off the grime, and slid it back into the camcorder. This time I watched closely, pausing and rewinding, searching for anything I might have missed. And then I saw it. In the background, just behind the desk, was a wall covered in photos. They were blurry, too out of focus to make out clearly, but the shapes... There were people in those photos, faces, and some of them looked disturbingly familiar. One of them looked like Harold. After seeing the photos on the tape, I couldn't sleep. Harold's story, the disappearances, the strange deliveries, everything clicked into place, forming a picture too horrifying to ignore. But the picture was incomplete. The faces on the wall haunted me. Harold's expression, blurry but unmistakable, was frozen in fear. And there were others, people who looked vaguely familiar, like I'd seen them in passing once and forgotten. I needed answers. I started revisiting the locations mentioned in the police reports. The diner where the teenagers had last been seen, the motel where the delivery driver had stayed the night before he vanished. I interviewed old co-workers of Daniel Carter, scoured every archive I could find, and even reached out to the families of some of the victims. Every thread led back to the warehouse. And then, one night, a package arrived at my door. I wasn't expecting anything. The box was small and unmarked, with no return address. I almost didn't open it. Something about it felt wrong. Inside was a single videotape. There was no label, no explanation. Just the tape, sitting there like an accusation. I sat on the couch, staring at it for what felt like hours. My hands shook as I slid it into the camcorder and hit play. The screen flickered to life, showing a familiar scene, the warehouse office. But this time, the footage was clearer, more recent. The desk was empty, but the chair was occupied. It was me. My heart pounded as I watched myself on the screen. I was sitting in the chair, looking directly into the camera. My face was pale, my expression blank. I didn't remember this. I couldn't have been there. Then, slowly, I turned to look behind me. The camera panned, revealing the wall of photos I'd seen on the earlier tape. But this time, the photos were sharper, the faces clearer. I recognized all of them. Harold, the missing steelworker, the cleaning crew supervisor, the teenagers, and in the center of the wall, surrounded by all the others, was my own face. The screen cut to static. I don't remember deciding to go back. It felt less like a decision and more like an inevitability, like the warehouse had been calling me all along. The lot was empty when I arrived, the air thick with mist. The building was gone, replaced by an expanse of gravel and weeds. But as I stood there, I noticed something, barely visible in the fog. A hatch. The hatch was identical to the one I'd seen in the warehouse, its edges rusted and worn. My hands trembled as I gripped the handle and pulled. The ladder descended into darkness, the same oppressive smell rising to meet me. I hesitated, but I couldn't stop myself. The basement was still there, untouched. The walls were damp and streaked with mold, the air thick and sour. I followed the corridor, my flashlight trembling. The doors were the same, their handles corroded, some still slightly ajar. When I reached the final room, I froze. The table was gone. The shelves were empty, but the camera remained, mounted on the ceiling. Its red light blinked steadily, like it had been waiting for me. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye, a reflection in a puddle on the floor. I wasn't alone. The figure was standing behind me, its face hidden in the shadows. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but the room was empty. Then the door slammed shut. I screamed, pounding on the metal, but it wouldn't budge. The walls felt closer now, the air thicker. The red light of the camera blinked rhythmically, as if mocking me. That's when I heard it. The faint hum of machinery, the whir of a motor coming to life. The room filled with light, and the camera panned down toward me, and on the wall where the photos had been was a new image. It was me. I woke up outside the warehouse without remembering how I got there. You probably think I'm crazy. Maybe I am. But if you're reading this, do one thing for me. Don't go looking for answers. Some places hold on to things, secrets, pain, memories, and some places don't let go. The warehouse may be gone, but I know it's still out there, waiting for someone else to find it. And when they do, they'll see what I saw. And they'll never leave.